Okay, well, hello and welcome everybody. I'm Richard Kravitz, the director at UCCS. It's great to have you all here for our regular UCCS speaker series. This is the concluding speaker series event of the quarter. And after this, we'll be taking a brief break, but I did want to call your attention to two important talks upcoming, one on April 7th, on COVID-19 vaccines, where are we now and where are we going, by a UCSF investigator at the cutting edge of vaccine science. And then 2 weeks after that, for a talk that might be of interest to many of you, given that it touches on the environmental area, do we have the science we need to predict wildfire and its impacts in California? That's on April 21st, and there'll be a panel joining us from UCLA. But now let's get right into it. So the Emerging Scholars Program at UCCS recognizes and encourages outstanding research on issues germane to public policy in California. And it's research performed by University of California graduate students. Since 2015, UCCS has made 10 awards, including this one, with winners coming from across the UC system, including Berkeley, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, Irvine, and now UC Davis. To introduce this year's winner, I'm pleased to share this Zoom platform with a member of our UCCS academic team. Sharif Amlani is an advanced fifth-year graduate student in the Department of Political Science at UC Davis. Sharif focuses on American politics with specific interests in the relationship between money and politics in the US Congress. He was a summa cum laude graduate of the University of New Mexico, where he did original research as well as internships with Congresswoman Michelle Grisham and Senator Martin Heinrich. So it's been wonderful to have Sharif around as a member of our center team, and it's my pleasure to turn things over to him now. So Sharif, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Kravitz, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the winner of last year's UCCS Emerging Scholars Award and our speaker for today's Wednesday speaker series, Kristen Dobbin. Kristen is a PhD candidate in the grad group in ecology at the University of California, Davis, where her research focuses on the intersection of environmental justice and water governance. Her dissertation looks at the challenges and opportunities associated with California's landmark groundwater reform law, known as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. Prior to coming to Davis, Kristen served as Regional Water Management Coordinator at the Community Water Center in Venezuela, California. She is a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow, a Switzer Environmental Fellow, Fulbright Fellow, and UDAW Scholar. Her talk today is called The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Human Rights to Water. Ladies and gentlemen, Kristen Dobbin.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Sharif, for that kind introduction. I am honored to be here with you all today and really grateful for the opportunity to share my dissertation research on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the human right to water. Ooh, gotta do this. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge that all of this research has been made possible by the tireless support of a lot of different people. I've been really privileged to have 4 amazing research assistants contribute to various phases of this project, including Jessica, Michael, Amanda, and Ernie, and to work in collaboration with Darcy Bostick, who just finished her master's in hydrology at UC Davis. My advisor and committee have supported this project start to finish, which has also been made possible by generous funding from NSF, as well as the UC Davis College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences. And last but not least, this project is made possible by all of the community residents, organizations, and technical assistance providers that have really thanklessly contributed their time and knowledge and expertise to this project since 2017. And without them, I would have basically nothing to share with you today. So for my talk today, I'm going to start with some background on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the human right to water, and what these two state policies have to do with each other. Next, I'm going to spend some time on the challenges and opportunities for ensuring low-income community or DAC participation in SIGMA. And next, I will end by discussing the related challenges and opportunities for integrating drinking water into groundwater sustainability plans. So let's get started with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which we have come to know by the acronym SIGMA. SIGMA was signed by then Governor Brown in 2014 with the intent of providing for the sustainable management of the state's groundwater resources. The title of the legislation is fairly informative in this case, which is nice. And to understand that goal and its importance, it's important to remember where we were in 2014. We were deep in a historic drought that had significantly curtailed available surface water supplies, leading to increased groundwater pumping from levels that it's important to note were already unsustainable over the long-term average to levels that were unprecedented with grave social and environmental consequences. As a result of this pumping, we saw land subsidence rapidly accelerate, reaching almost a foot a year in some places in the Central Valley. And we saw domestic wells and even some public water supply wells go dry by the thousands. These conditions triggered emergency health and safety conditions and necessitated sending hauled water to tens of thousands of Californians and required millions in state funding for interim and long-term solutions. Thus, given these conditions, it was abundantly clear that the existing regime of spotty voluntary groundwater management across the state was insufficient to protect California's interests. So SIGMA was passed to create a new path forward built around a framework of mandatory local management and monitoring. Famously, Governor Brown remarked when signing the bill that groundwater management in California is best accomplished locally. And this sentiment is baked into every aspect of SIGMA's design, which empowers local collaboration among stakeholders to manage their shared groundwater resources, and only allows for state involvement as a technical assistance provider and as a backstop in the event that locals either do not wish to manage their groundwater resources or fail to do so adequately. SIGMA is modeled after decades of science promoting the benefits of collaborative governance and integrated water resources management, which has really demonstrated numerous benefits, including increased stakeholder buy-in, reduced conflict, and improved management at reduced costs. So SIGMA has 3 basic steps for implementation, which I imagine some of you are familiar with. The first is the formation of groundwater sustainability agencies, which we know as GSAs, and this was required to be done by June 2017. This step was necessary because previously, without having mandatory groundwater management, we also didn't have public agencies that had the necessary powers, let alone the responsibility to manage groundwater. So then the second step is the development of groundwater sustainability plans, known as GSPs. And I'll try to kind of refresh my acronyms throughout this presentation. And GSPs are basically a mechanism by which locals are going to define sustainability for their groundwater basin, and then define a path and steps to achieving that sustainability. Under SIGMA, groundwater sustainability plans were either due last January or will be due this upcoming January 2022. And then the third step is the implementation of those plans to achieve sustainability in 20 years. It's important to note that SIGMA does not apply to the whole state. It only applies to high and medium priority groundwater basins, which are those marked in yellow and orange on this map. But those groundwater basins cover not only the vast majority of our state's population, I think it's about 83%, but also nearly all the groundwater pumping that is happening in the state. And as another side note, for those basins that submitted their plans last January, in January 2020, the Department of Water Resources is currently reviewing those plans, and we're expecting some initial determinations about adequacy of those plans coming this spring. So for any of you that followed this legislation or know about its passage, you know that this was no small legislative feat. SIGMA was supported by a diverse coalition of actors, and that included environmental justice advocates. And the deep involvement of these advocates and their significant investment of time and resources in passing SIGMA reflects the critical importance of sustainable groundwater management for advancing the human right to water in the state. because despite the fact that California passed a law known as AB 685, which I'll come back to in a minute, affirming the human right to water, which was done in 2012, California continues to be plagued by a chronic drinking water crisis in which more than 1 million Californians are impacted by unsafe drinking water each year. And more than 6.6 million Californians have been impacted by primary drinking water violations of the Safe Drinking Water Act since 2012. And it's important to note that these numbers are underestimates for a couple key reasons, but maybe most critically because they don't reflect the water quality of 2 million Californians served by unregulated private domestic wells or state small water systems. And while we know very little about their water quality of these 2 million Californians, we have reason to believe it's actually much worse than the public water system counterparts that are displayed on this map and in these statistics. So thanks to the work of public health scholars like Carolina Palas, among others, we know very clearly that these drinking water violations disproportionately impact rural, low-income Latino communities. And if you look at this map, you can see that there's a high concentration of violations in the Central and Salinas valleys. So not only are we facing significant water quality challenges as a state, but as I mentioned earlier, during the recent drought and continuing to this day, we are also facing unprecedented supply challenges around the state. Nearly 3,000 homes have reported outages since the state started tracking in 2013, and the real number of outages is likely much higher. And more than 150 public water systems have required state emergency assistance in order to maintain service to their customers. So it may be obvious, but it's worth stating explicitly that groundwater and its management is at the root of these challenges. Small and rural low-income communities, which in California we often refer to as disadvantaged communities or DACs, which is defined as communities with a median household income of 80% or less of the state's average. So that's roughly $50,000 a year or less. Those disadvantaged communities are disproportionately affected by water quality and quantity challenges precisely because of their unique groundwater vulnerabilities. These communities are generally 100% reliant on groundwater as their drinking water source. And they also, due to their small size, are usually reliant on just one or a few shallow wells. This means that when groundwater conditions change or deteriorate, they are the first ones to be impacted. And they also have limited to no backup options when they are. Groundwater is, of course, a shared resource. So an individual community or an individual domestic well owner can't remedy these challenges on their own. And unlike more resourced other users, these communities or individual users tend to lack the resources to respond or mitigate or adapt to the changes as they occur, resulting in the inequalities we see throughout the state. And it's for these reasons that SGMA has several provisions related to drinking water and DACs. The legislation specifically identifies not only public water systems, but also small water systems, domestic wells, and disadvantaged communities as beneficial users of groundwater. And then throughout the legislation, beneficial users of groundwater are required to be involved in every aspect of the program. From the get-go, groundwater sustainability agencies were also required to identify disadvantaged community and public water system stakeholders as interested parties when they submitted their filing to become a GSA to the Department of Water Resources. Further, the regulations for the implementation of SGMA that were developed by the Department of Water Resources and adopted by the California Water Commission requires for the identification, description, and accounting of all groundwater users in GSPs, as well as accounting for the potential effects of management decisions on them, which is key, and we'll come back to that. So going back briefly to the state's human right to water law, AB 685, which was passed in 2012, it's worth noting that this legislation does not just establish that it is the policy of California that every human has the right to safe and affordable and accessible drinking water. This law also requires that state agencies, inclusive of both the Department of Water Resources as well as the State Water Resources Control Board, two agencies that have a lot to do with the implementation of SGMA, It requires that state agencies consider access to safe and affordable drinking water in all aspects of their work, be it adopting or revising regulations, grant criteria, etc. So what all this means is that not only are these two policies intricately related, but arguably the success of each is bound up with the other. We cannot realize the human right to water without sustainable groundwater management, and we cannot achieve sustainable groundwater management as defined in SGMA without adequately accounting for vulnerable drinking water users of groundwater. So for a long time, I've been calling this intersection a place of opportunities and challenges. But about a year or so ago, a state water board official called this intersection the elephant in the room. And I think that's much more compelling, so I've stolen it. My dissertation research basically aims to investigate this elephant. I am looking at the intersection of SGMA and the human right to water, including these points of contention, as well as trying to identify opportunities for increased alignment. And the various phases of my research can be summarized by 4 guiding questions, which I'm going to walk through for the remainder of our time together today, starting with the question of how small disadvantaged communities are involved in SGMA implementation throughout the state. So to understand how small disadvantaged communities are involved in SGMA, we first need to understand how many are subject to SGMA, so fall in those high and medium priority groundwater basins. And given that the majority of the state's population is in these groundwater basins, it isn't so surprising that a lot of disadvantaged communities are also impacted by the law. And when I say small, which is what I'm focusing on here in my presentation, I'm meaning communities with a population of less than 10,000 people. And so there are 545 small disadvantaged communities in the state, and 243 of those, almost exactly half, fall within high and medium priority basins subject to SGMA. And the majority of those communities are in the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and Tulare Lake hydrologic regions, as you can see in this table. So the first thing I did in my research was to try to in order to try to understand the involvement of these 243 communities in the process, is to look at the Groundwater Sustainability Agency notices that each agency submitted to the Department of Water Resources. And those notices include details on their formation, including who's involved in the governance of that agency, as well as those initial parties lists I mentioned earlier. And my first key finding is that small disadvantaged communities are generally not formally represented in groundwater sustainability agencies. Just 17% of these communities are represented on GSA governing boards. And if I break those numbers out into incorporated and unincorporated communities, it actually, for unincorporated communities, those numbers look a lot worse. Just about 10% of unincorporated disadvantaged communities are on the board of their overlying GSA, compared to roughly 50% of small disadvantaged cities. In addition to incorporation status, I have research published in a 2019 paper that demonstrates representation is also highly dependent on community size and community income. And so the smallest and poorest communities are also those least likely to be represented on GSAs. And notably, this issue of representation in groundwater management extends all the way to the individual level. I'm currently working on analyzing the representation of GSAs at the board of directors level with another UC Davis student, Ernie Echaveste. And our initial findings indicate that only approximately 15% of GSA board members are women, and more than 80% are likely non-Hispanic white based on surname analysis. Notably, there's at least 3 GSAs in the state that have board of directors with individuals entirely from the same family. So I also, in looking at these GSA notifications, looked at the submitted interested parties lists and compared them to a spatial analysis locating small disadvantaged communities inside GSA boundaries using the Department of Water Resources DAC mapping tool. And I found that similarly, the prevalence of these communities is not well accounted for on the lists, despite a requirement in the water code to list them. Only about 55% of these communities appeared anywhere on the list of interested parties submitted by their GSA. And so when we look at these numbers by GSA, I find that just over half, 51% of GSAs successfully identified the small disadvantaged communities in their boundaries, but nearly a quarter, 23%, identified none of the disadvantaged communities in their boundaries. And so this example on the screen is a notification where disadvantaged communities, you can see at the bottom, are listed as no known at this time. But based on the DWR mapping tool, there's actually 8 disadvantaged communities in this area. So disadvantaged communities are not on governing boards, are not listed in interested parties lists, does not mean that they're not participating in SIGMA. SIGMA is a public process intended to engage diverse stakeholders, and there are a lot of other ways by which communities may be participating. So to get at this, I conducted 27 semi-structured interviews with representatives of disadvantaged communities, as well as a few technical assistance providers in the Tulare Lake and the San Joaquin hydrologic regions. And the kind of clearest finding from these interviews is that the lack of formal representation of these communities does not indicate a lack of participation, and it certainly does not indicate a lack of interest on the part of these communities. Disadvantaged community residents and water system board and staff from these communities expressed an extremely high level of interest in SIGMA, and many saw SIGMA as absolutely critical to both the present and future of their communities. And because of this, many were actually engaged in a variety of ways with SIGMA implementation, ranging from being on the board to participating in advisory committees, to attending meetings and workshops, and others were monitoring mailing lists and reading kind of agendas and meeting minutes. And a quote from one of my interviewees that I think really nicely characterizes this shared sentiment, I would like to read to you all now. So this interviewee said, "We care about water. I care about water. I care about drinking water. I care about surface water. I care about groundwater. We want to be at the table. I know we are little, but we don't want to be left behind. We want to know what's going on." So despite the high level of interest and kind of the diverse means of participation of my interviewees, across all the interviews, it was reported that they were often not as involved as they wanted to be, or not as involved as they thought they should be. And for many, this had to do with a lot of barriers they were facing. And as I conducted these interviews, these barriers came up time and time again from GSA to GSA and from basin to basin, such that after coding the transcripts for all these interviews, myself and my research assistants were able to group these challenges into 6 primary buckets. So the first one being that interviewees reported limited capacity and resources to participate. Second and third being challenges with accessibility and transparency. Fourth was the lack of formal representation and decision-making authority of these communities, reflected in their kind of low representation on governing boards. Fifth was a lot of concerns about limited opportunities to provide input and feedback that was meaningful. And lastly, overall, most interviewees reported that SIGMA meetings and GSA meetings were not addressing drinking water interests and priorities in the way they thought they should or would. So for me, the question then becomes, what can be done to increase disadvantaged community involvement in SIGMA? And to answer this question, it's helpful to dive a little bit deeper into these shared challenges. So I find it helpful to boil them down even further into concerns about access, as well as concerns about influence. And I'm going to leave the last issue, the lack of addressing drinking water, for later, and I will come back to that at the end of the talk. So related to access, there were a lot of barriers. Even if a small disadvantaged community had a community water system, which not all of them did, some were private well communities, they often had no or limited staff, and volunteer board members did a lot of the work operating these systems. And these volunteers hold jobs, they have other responsibilities, and it was extremely difficult to get to daytime work hours meetings that the GSAs were holding. Even for those that had staff for their water systems, those staff reported that kind of keeping their offices open and the day-to-day work that they had to do to keep their water systems running was prohibitive of attending Sigma meetings, especially given that most GSAs are holding many meetings per month. One interviewee reported that their GSA was holding 7 meetings per month. And they were quite frankly just like, we can't keep up. One thing to note is that particularly for those communities with safe drinking water challenges already, like whether they be a quality issue or a well issue, they were particularly challenged to attend Sigma meetings given all of the other work they were tackling related to water in their community. Further, even when there was a staff member or a volunteer who was able and willing to attend meetings, there were a lot of concerns about irregular meeting schedules and a lack of transparency about when and where meetings were happening that made it challenging to attend. There are also ongoing challenges with language access. Most GSA meetings do not provide Spanish language interpretation. And even English speakers reported that the kind of technical groundwater jargon in these meetings and kind of the heavy presence of professionals and consultants made it difficult to follow the conversations, even if they were English proficient. And lastly, I want to note that it was really common for interviewees to report difficulty in accessing the materials in which meetings were discussing. So whether that was kind of supporting documentation or data. And a lot of people remarked that because they didn't have access to kind of the different materials that were being discussed in the meetings, it was hard to engage in those meetings. So moving on to influence, for many of those that did attend meetings, there was a sense that their attendance was insignificant. And that is to say, they felt like either the meeting lacked opportunities to provide comments, and it was just a very formal, structured business conversation that left no room for discussion. Or even if there was room for discussion and input, they felt like their position as a small groundwater user or their kind of lack of voting authority on the GSA meant that their input wasn't well accounted for or addressed in the conversation. And these issues were really compounded by quick turnaround times for public comment on important documents. A lot of interviewees noted that most GSPs are thousands of pages long, and yet they had 30 days to review these documents. And even for those who did manage to get in comments, a lot of them noted that there wasn't time for the Groundwater Sustainability Agency to incorporate those comments and make changes by the deadline of needing to submit their final plan. And so they felt like their comments fell on deaf ears. So based on these challenges, what can be done? At the GSA level, the interviewees had a lot of recommendations to address these challenges, and we put out a report in 2019 called Communities' Perspectives on Sigma Implementation that went into detail on all these recommendations, so I'm actually not going to go into them here. But I do want to note that these recommendations are not only highly applicable to those basins who are turning in their plans next January, but they're still very much applicable to those basins that already turned in their plans, given that those plans are going to require revision and updating in the coming years, as well as implementation as well. So these interviews also surfaced many suggestions relevant to the state's role as a technical assistance provider and overseer of the process. And these findings included finding ways to require, or at least incentivize, more diverse representation on groundwater sustainability agencies, especially for drinking water users. And also providing more public guidance to GSAs on community drinking water needs and expectations and best practices for stakeholder engagement. Notably, Proposition 1, which was the 2014 water bond, included funding for Sigma technical assistance. And ultimately, I think about 16.2 million was allocated to that purpose. And my interviewees found a very positive impact from this program. In many cases, this funding and the support of technical assistance providers was credited for initiating an individual's involvement in the process or for sustaining their involvement in that process. So a key opportunity is to maintain and build on this progress by reallocating funding for Sigma technical assistance. And lastly, we can't lose sight as a state about the ongoing importance of training and capacity building to build broad participation in Sigma and other water management programs, including, for example, the state's integrated regional water management program. So at this point, I want to step back out of the weeds and kind of ask the question, why do we care about disadvantaged community participation in SGMA? And there's absolutely a strong case to be made that as a public resource, groundwater management should be public and inclusive, and especially should be public and inclusive of those most impacted by the decisions. But there's also a utilitarian argument to be made here, that there's a lot of research and experience that shows, both in environmental justice and in water management, that participation is a pathway to shaping the outcomes of a program. So if we want groundwater sustainability plans to reflect our state's human right to water commitment, we have a reason to believe that supporting and increasing disadvantaged community involvement will further that goal. But I think it's also important to remember that that is not the only pathway to that goal. And so the second half of my dissertation is really concerned with evaluating the 45 groundwater sustainability plans that were submitted last January from a drinking water perspective, and then exploring opportunities to integrate drinking water into groundwater management through those plans as policy documents. And so for the remaining of our time together, a little roughly 10-ish minutes, I'm going to go through the findings of our human right to water assessment of the 45 submitted GSPs, cover some promising examples from the GSPs around the state, and then look at opportunities for moving forward in that direction. So first off, while drinking water users may consume a relatively small amount of groundwater proportional to other uses in the state, we do know that these users are abundant in critically overdrafted areas where plans have already been submitted. So those basins that submitted their plans last year are marked in gray on this map. And just with those 45 plans in those gray basins, there's nearly 250 communities covered by these plans. And more than half of those are disadvantaged low-income communities. And all these communities almost rely exclusively on groundwater. And as a result, there's actually more than 36,000 domestic wells in these areas, as well as more than 6,000 public supply wells. Notably, the extent of drinking water users in any given plan varies. There are groundwater sustainability plans submitted that have no communities or no public water systems, and maybe as few as just one domestic well. But there are also GSPs with dozens of communities, hundreds of public water systems, and thousands of drinking water wells. So a primary goal of our GSP assessment was to determine how these prevalent drinking water users are reflected in the plans as they were submitted. And we found that many groundwater sustainability plans were missing a thorough and sometimes any description of these types of users. So where applicable, the number and locations of disadvantaged communities was detailed in 74% of the plans. And I think it's worth noting that that is progress from the 55% we saw in the GSA notifications, but it still leaves more than a quarter of communities unaddressed in their plans. Looking at public water systems, just 55% of the submitted plans provided kind of the locations and kind of number of wells serving public water systems. And then if you look at domestic well owners, it's actually even worse. Only 33% of plans provided descriptive information about domestic wells in their plan area. And 31% of plans provided no descriptive information about domestic wells whatsoever. It was also interesting to note that most plans did not account for population growth in calculating their projected water budgets. So this general lack of discussion of drinking water users is mirrored in a lack of discussion about drinking water issues in these plans. Most plans did not discuss water conditions in terms of state or federal drinking water standards. Most plans did not discuss the compliance status of local water systems in their plan area. And 2/3 of plans made zero reference to drinking water challenges during the recent historic drought. So perhaps unsurprisingly, based on these findings, most plans did not discuss the potential impact of their selected management criteria on drinking water users, even though that was a requirement under the SGMA regulations. Less than a third of plans did this for both water quality and water quantity sustainable management criteria. But 11 plans of the 45 did include technical analysis of the potential impacts for potentially dry wells across their management area. And another 7 did such an analysis for part of their plan area, but not the whole plan area. Luckily, SGMA is a topic of great interest in the state, and several researchers and other stakeholders have kind of stepped up to fill this gap and assess the potential impacts under the plans, particularly looking at domestic well dewatering under the proposed GSPs. So this includes my collaborator, Darcy Bostic, who did her master's thesis at UC Davis on this. And another similar study was done by EKI through the Water Foundation. And these studies estimate that anywhere from 50 to 60% of domestic wells could go dry in 2040 based on the management criteria put forth in the submitted plans. So if you calculate the number of people served by those wells, you get as many as 127,000 Californians, additional Californians could lose their water supply by 2040 under these plans. And notably, it's really notable that these domestic well failure rates that are projected in these studies are actually on pace with a hypothetical no SGMA business as usual scenario that was published by Rich Palu and co-authors in Environmental Research Letters. So that indicates that at least when it comes to domestic well users and in critically overdrafted basins where plans have been submitted, SGMA may not be improving future outcomes as is. And as of now, we do not have any similar projections about the impacts to public supply wells, but I do know that the Pacific Institute is currently working on a project to do that. And that information will help us round out our understanding of the potential impacts of these plans. So when it comes to water quality, the findings are similarly concerning. 44% of plans set no criteria for drinking water constituents like nitrates or arsenic or 123 TCP. For those that did set criteria for drinking water constituents, most did not align their criteria with state and federal drinking water standards known as MCLs. And further, for those plans that did set standards, most of them allowed for increasing concentrations of contaminants up to 20%. And they didn't require action to be taken to remedy exceedances beyond 20% until as many as 2/3 of the monitoring wells had passed that threshold. So an essential component of groundwater sustainability plans are the proposed projects and management actions that are intended to take the area, make the area achieve the sustainable management criteria by 2040. And just 15 of the 45 plans included projects with drinking water benefits. And just 12 of the 34 plans with DACs in their boundaries included projects that would benefit one or more disadvantaged communities. And this is somewhat disappointing because I think for many, certainly for myself, the creation of multi-benefit projects that simultaneously supported groundwater sustainability and drinking water goals was an exciting prospect of the SGMA process. Further, very few plans included mitigation as a management action. Just 5 plans committed to developing mitigation programs for addressing adverse impacts of their management criteria. So the last kind of thing I'm going to touch on here is that's a lot of bad news, but there's also good news. There's across the 45 groundwater sustainability plans, there's ample examples of where sustainable groundwater planning is simultaneously being used to advance safe drinking water access, often in a multi-beneficial way. So the first kind of success I'd like to note is that there's clear evidence among the 45 submitted plans that the early state emphasis on communication and engagement and providing translation and interpretation really did shape SGMA implementation. 2/3 of plans included communications and engagement plans along the lines of the template that the Department of Water Resources provided to GSAs. And 56% of plans reported providing translation or interpretation in at least some instances, typically for public workshops. And this is really good news in that it highlights an openness and maybe even a desire on the part of GSAs for technical assistance and more state guidance and resources, and highlights an opportunity to increase and provide similar support moving forward. Another positive finding is that while certainly not all GSAs used advisory boards or stakeholder committees, where they were used, almost all of these bodies had representation for drinking water and disadvantaged community stakeholders. And then lastly, as previously mentioned, several plans assessed potential impacts to domestic water, to domestic wells or to public supply wells. And many plans also included multi-benefit projects and other human right to water supporting policies. So some examples of the policies that we found across the GSPs. One comes from the Indian Wells Valley GSP, which affirmed the human right to water as a core consideration in their plan development. Demonstrating a similar commitment, the Cuyama Basin GSP leveraged the opportunity to develop groundwater projects to increase the drought resilience of 2 local communities, both of which had been negatively impacted in the recent drought because of their reliance on just a single supply well. Another example comes from the Santa Cruz Mid-County GSP, which evaluated potential funding mechanisms and fee criteria with affordability and equity criteria. And they did so with the explicit goal of adopting a funding mechanism that supports affordability for essential health and safety purposes. So when we take this all together, both the limitation and the successes we found in our groundwater sustainability plan review, we come up with kind of several key opportunities for increasing the integration of drinking water into groundwater sustainability plans. The first I'd like to note is the opportunity for increased coordination between the Department of Water Resources and the State Board, particularly the board's Division of Drinking Water, which holds key drinking water related data, which was severely underutilized in these plans. And based on the aforementioned kind of receptiveness of GSAs to state issued guidance, there's a clear opportunity to issue joint guidance on community drinking water needs and increase the use of drinking water data and information, both in the 2022 plans that will be submitted, as well as in 2020 plan revisions and updates. Second, based on the findings about the really serious potential impacts of GSPs to drinking water users, it's clear we need to institute drinking water impact assessments for all GSPs, as well as ongoing impact monitoring. And if we do this, then we as a state will have more information about how SGMA is impacting the human right to water implementation, and that will allow us to make adjustments as necessary. Finally, not only did we see marked improvement in disadvantaged community participation, where there was technical assistance funding awarded, but we also see those plans that had technical assistance providers funded in their areas have more attention to drinking water in them. And this indicates that kind of renewing the SGMA technical assistance funding can help further integrate drinking water into these plans. And then lastly, we did see a fair number of projects where drinking water and groundwater priorities are being pursued simultaneously through kind of multi-benefit projects like in Cuyama. And so there are some GSAs that are headed in that direction, but there's also clear room to encourage more of those win-win solutions with such as targeted recharge or domestic water conservation, if we set aside funding for disadvantaged community benefiting projects as well as for mitigation. So that was a lot of information. If for some reason you find yourself wanting more, I have provided here a list of various research projects from these different research phases, as well as some additional relevant research for further reading. I've tried to note where materials are also available in Spanish. And I guess with that, I will end and say thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and thanks to the UC Center Sacramento for the opportunity and recognition of this award. And I'm really looking forward to getting some questions and engaging in conversation with everyone. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ms. Dobbin, for just a fantastic talk today. And I'm just going to pause right here so that Brooke can go ahead and end the recording.